Ready? Let's begin. The shadow figure. Something is wrong with this carving. You are standing in the great temple complex of ancient Ur, sometime around 3200 BC, and the stone relief in front of you is perfectly standard, a divine assembly of gods receiving petitions from worshippers. Every figure is named in the cuneiform text beside it. Every figure except one, the most prominent figure in the composition, positioned at the center of the sacred gathering, has been deliberately smoothed. The face erased before the clay hardened. The Sumerians were not careless record keepers. They documented grain deliveries, legal disputes, and the movements of planets with exhausting precision. Sumerologist Samuel Noah Kramer, in his foundational 1963 work on Sumerian civilization, noted that certain attendant figures in temple art remain deliberately unidentified in the accompanying cuneiform texts. This was not an oversight. In Sumerian scribal tradition, every depicted being received a name. Silence was a choice, and choices had consequences. What makes this pattern extraordinary is its consistency. Across at least 14 distinct excavated panels from Ur, Nippur, and Eridu, three of Sumer's oldest ceremonial centers, the same unnamed figure appears over a span of 600 years. It is consistently depicted smaller than divine beings, but larger than human worshippers, placing it in an unnamed middle category. It never acts. It never receives offerings. It is always present at the moment of divine transaction, and it is always watching. The same unnamed observer convention appears in pre-dynastic Egyptian tomb art and in Olmec ceremonial reliefs from Mesoamerica, cultures separated by oceans and millennia. The figure doesn't carry a weapon. It doesn't bear a symbol. It occupies space the way a witness occupies a courtroom, present not to participate, but to ensure the record is complete. Why would a civilization that named its demons, its winds, and its diseases choose to leave one figure deliberately anonymous? The absence of a name in a culture obsessed with naming is not a gap in the record. It is the record. Something was present. The Sumerians knew it, and they decided, carefully, deliberately, that it should not be identified. The stone figure. Imagine walking through 4 different museums on 4 different continents, separated by decades of travel and thousands of kilometers of ocean. In each museum, in each collection, from 4 civilizations that shared no language and no trade route and no mythology, you stop in front of the same figure, upright, arms at the sides, feet together, eyes open and forward-facing, blank. The same figure, carved by hands that never knew the others existed. Before the Bronze Age, before writing, before the wheel, human cultures were producing figurines. Most were expressive, narrative, local, shaped by the concerns of the community that made them. You can look at a Mesopotamian idol and know something about Mesopotamian life. The figures were portraits of a world. But there is a separate category, found on every inhabited continent, that refuses to be local. It arrives without context and leaves without explanation. The Cycladic figurines of Greece, dating to roughly 3200 BC, share their proportional ratios and blank forward-facing convention with Nok terracottas from Nigeria, produced around 500 BC, with Valdivia figurines from coastal Ecuador dated to 3500 BC, and with early clay figures from the Jomon period in Japan, some of the oldest ceramic objects in human history. None of these cultures had contact with each other at the relevant dates. Archaeologist Maria Gimbutas documented the Western tradition in her 1974 work on the goddesses and gods of Old Europe, noting the uncanny cross-cultural consistency in body posture. In the 1960s, archaeologist Emilio Estrada proposed direct Pacific contact to explain the resemblance between Valdivia and Jomon examples. Mainstream archaeology still disputes it. The detail that gets lost in that debate is the expression, or rather, the absence of one. These cultures produced expressive, emotional, narrative art in every other context. The blankness on these specific objects was deliberate, a face designed to convey nothing, or to receive something that came from outside the stone. Every culture on Earth, working in isolation, decided to carve the same blank, upright, forward-facing figure and place it in their most sacred contexts. When that many independent decisions produce the same result, it stops being coincidence. It starts looking like memory. The masked figure. 7,000 years before the first Egyptian dynasty, someone in the Judean desert carved a human face from stone and placed it over the skull of the dead. Not the face of the person buried. A different face. Idealized, symmetrical, with wide-open eyes that belong to no known deity and no known myth. The Nahal Himar cave masks of present-day Israel are the oldest masks on Earth, and from the moment of their discovery, they refuse to make sense. Masks in the ancient world are well-understood objects. They represent gods, ancestors, protective spirits, theatrical characters. They have names. They have stories. They belong to a tradition that can be traced, documented, and explained. The Nahal Himar masks belong to no such tradition. They predate every mythology we know of by thousands of years, and the face they depict has never been matched to any figure in any surviving text from any culture. Within 2 centuries of the Nahal Himar masks, near-identical masked burial practices appear at Ain Ghazal in Jordan and at Catalhoyuk in Turkey. Thousands of years later, the same convention surfaces in pre-Columbian burial sites in Ecuador and coastal Peru. Anthropologist Ian Coit of the University of Notre Dame, in a 2008 study in Current Anthropology, identified what he called a standardized mortuary figure across Neolithic burial cultures, a specific face placed on the dead across unconnected traditions. The consistent feature across every example is the same: large, wide-open eyes, a convention that does not appear in the art of the same cultures when depicting living human beings. What Kite noted, and what almost no popular account has foregrounded, is that the skull dimensions beneath several masks at Ain Ghazal were inconsistent with the facial proportions depicted above them. The mask wasn't a portrait of the dead. It wasn't honoring them. It was replacing them, covering one face with another, in a gesture that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with identity. Across 8,000 years and 4 continents, humanity placed the same wide-eyed, anonymous face over its dead. Every other funerary tradition we know of was built around memory, around preserving what the person looked like and who they were. This one was built around replacement. The question isn't why they covered the face. The question is whose face they put there instead. The elongated figure. Before the familiar broad-shouldered pharaoh iconography of the Egyptian dynasties, there was an older style, pre-dynastic Naqada, Seku period artifacts, dated to roughly 3,500 to 3,200 BC, and cataloged extensively by Egyptologist Flinders Petrie in the 1890s, include ivory figurines and pottery paintings depicting figures that look nothing like the Egypt we know. They are tall, impossibly thin, with skulls that extend upward in a smooth, unbroken curve. They appear in the oldest layer of Egyptian art. Once the dynasties solidify, they vanish from the official record. The elongated figure is not a pre-dynastic anomaly. It resurfaces. During the Amarna period under Pharaoh Akhenaten, around 1353 to 1336 BC, official state art depicts the entire royal family with dramatically extended skulls, elongated necks, and limbs drawn to proportions no human body possesses. Egyptologist Joanne Fletcher has argued these depictions may reflect actual physical characteristics, either emphasized through ritual practice or present in the bloodline itself. Most Egyptologists prefer to call it artistic convention. That explanation gets harder to sustain when you account for the geography. Identical elongated figure iconography appears in Tiwanaku, Bolivia, dated between 500 and 1000 AD. It appears in the Paracas culture of coastal Peru, dated between 800 and 100 BC. It appears in Maltese temple art from 3600 BC, 2000 years before the Amarna period. In every culture where these figures appear in art, the practice of artificial cranial deformation is also present in the archaeological record. The art and the biology arrive together. Researcher Brian Forster, working with Paracas skull samples, reported cranial volumes running 25% larger than the modern human maximum. Artificial binding displaces volume. It does not create it. That finding remains outside peer-reviewed literature and should be treated with caution, but it has never been directly refuted by the institutions that hold the relevant samples. Elongated figures across every culture that depicted them are never shown performing labor. They are shown receiving reverence or giving instruction. When a civilization carves a figure with an impossible skull and places it above their kings, they aren't expressing creativity. They're expressing memory of something that once stood above them, the faceless figure. In the British Museum's collection of early dynastic Mesopotamian cylinder seals, there is a seal from roughly 2600 BC that stops researchers when they encounter it. Under magnification, it depicts a divine assembly, gods seated in rows, receiving petitions. Every figure is named in the accompanying cuneiform. Every figure except the most prominent one, seated at the center of the composition. Its face has been deliberately smoothed, erased while the clay was still workable. Someone made that choice, and they made it about the most important figure in the image. Thorkild Jacobsen, one of the 20th century's foremost Assyriologists, noted in his 1976 work, The Treasures of Darkness, that certain beings in Mesopotamian religious texts are described using a phrase that translates approximately as the ones whose face is not to be spoken, not hidden, not unknown, not to be spoken. The distinction matters. These were not obscure minor spirits. They occupied authority positions in the celestial hierarchy, and their faces were specifically excluded from representation. The convention is not exclusive to Mesopotamia. At Catalhoyuk, dated to around 7500 BC, specific figurines were found with features gouged out after firing, a deliberate act performed after the object was complete. In Minoan palace art from 1700 to 1450 BC, certain figures in procession scenes are depicted in profile with blank oval faces, distinct from the detailed portraiture applied to every other figure nearby. In early Zhou dynasty ritual bronzes from China, dated between 1046 and 771 BC, the same faceless convention applies specifically to beings occupying the tier between human and divine. In each tradition, the faceless figures are never minor. They hold positions of authority or surveillance. Every other category of sacred being, gods, demons, ancestors, received a face because a face was how you addressed them, appealed to them, recognized them. The faceless figures were given no face because they needed none. They were not there to be recognized. They were there to observe. Jacobsen's translation carries an alternative reading that has received almost no academic attention. The phrase rendered as "the ones whose face is not to be spoken" can also be translated as "the ones who have not yet shown their face." Every tradition understood that some things watching humanity had decided, for reasons entirely their own, not to be seen. The fractured figure. In a ritual pit in northern Syria, archaeologists working the Halaf cultural period, dated between 5900 and 4500 BC, found something that stopped the excavation. Not a weapon. Not a royal burial. A clay figure deliberately shattered. Not broken by time or accident, but broken by design, each fragment placed carefully in the pit in a sequence that preserved the original anatomy. The breaking was the ceremony. Max von Oppenheim documented dozens of these deposits beginning in 1899. The pattern was consistent across every example. The figurines had been broken at specific anatomical points, at the neck, the waist, and the ankles, suggesting a standardized ritual procedure that had been practiced and repeated over generations. This was not destruction. It was instruction, a ceremony precise enough to be passed down. The identical fragmentation pattern appears at Vinca culture sites in Serbia, dated to roughly 5,700 to 4,500 BC. It appears at Mehrgarh in Pakistan, across a span running from 7,000 to 2,500 BC. It appears at formative period sites in Oaxaca, Mexico, dated between 1500 and 500 BC. Archaeologist John Chapman of Durham University proposed the theory of enchainment in his 2000 monograph on fragmentation in archaeology, arguing that breaking a figure and distributing its pieces among participants created a bond, a shared custody of a divided identity. The theory is widely cited, but Chapman included a footnote observation that subsequent literature almost entirely omitted. In every culture he studied, the ritual fragmentation was applied not to figures of humans or animals, but exclusively to a specific iconographic category, upright, forward-facing, with extended or unusual cranial features. The anomalous figures were always the ones being broken. In the Mexican examples, the fragmentation specifically targeted the head, separating the face from the body in every case. Carbon dating of the Syrian deposits confirms the ritual was repeated at the same location over at least 400 years. The figurines were never repaired. No culture that practiced this ritual ever attempted to reassemble the figure. Humanity didn't just depict these figures. At some point, across every major civilization on Earth, it decided they needed to be ceremonially stopped. Not destroyed. Stopped. Carefully, repeatedly, with the kind of precision that only comes from generations of practice. The question that nobody has answered is what these figures were considered capable of doing if they were left whole. The ruin figure, before Egypt, before Mesopotamia, before the first city was built or the first crop was planted, someone in southeastern Turkey organized a pre-agricultural society into a labor force capable of constructing the largest ritual complex on Earth. They built it, they used it, and then, around 8000 BC, they came back and buried it under tons of carefully placed rubble. Deliberately, completely, leaving it preserved beneath the earth for 12,000 years. Göbekli Tepe, dated to at least 9600 BC, and excavated by Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute beginning in 1994, is the oldest temple on Earth. It predates Stonehenge by 7,000 years, and the Great Pyramid by 6,500. Schmidt spent 20 years working the site before his death in 2014. His central observation, one that appears in almost no popular coverage, was that the T-shaped pillars are not abstract columns. They have arms pressed to their sides, hands carved at the waist, and belts. They are figures. A temple of bodies, standing in circles, facing inward. Pillar 43, known as the Vulture Stone, carries astronomical symbols that researcher Martin Sweatman of the University of Edinburgh argued in a 2017 paper in Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry encode the date of a comet impact around 10,950 BC. The carvings may be a record of catastrophe. The figures depicted alongside them include animals that could not have coexisted in the region at the same time, suggesting either mythological composites or records of a world that existed before the site was built. There are estimated to be at least 16 more unexcavated enclosures at the site. What has been found is a fraction. In interviews near the end of his life, Schmidt said that the deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe remained the site's central mystery. Every other ancient monument was abandoned, destroyed, or repurposed. This one was sealed, with precision, by the people who built it. The oldest builders on Earth left a temple, a figure, and a deliberate act of erasure. They went to extraordinary lengths to bury what they had made, and they never came back. The sealed figure. In the city of Ur, In the death pits excavated by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934, workers encountered a sealed chamber that appeared in none of the known burial plans. Inside was a single clay figure, unlike anything recovered from the surrounding royal tombs. Its hands were bound, its mouth had been sealed with bitumen, and around its base, in early dynastic cuneiform, was a single repeated inscription: "It must not speak." Woolley's popular 1934 account, Ur of the Chaldees, gave this deposit almost no attention. The excavation reports archived at the British Museum are more revealing. The bound hands convention in Mesopotamian figurine magic is documented across multiple traditions. Clay figures with bound limbs were used to restrain malevolent forces, and the procedure is described in the Maklu anti-witchcraft text series. But those figures were small, roughly made, and domestic. The Ur figure was large, carefully crafted, and found in a context associated with royal ritual. It was not a household charm. It was a state concern. The Maklu texts deploy the Akkadian phrase rendered as "it must not speak" in reference to bound demonic entities, not human practitioners. Similar sealed and bound figures have been found at Nippur, dated around 2000 BC, in foundation deposits of the Inanna Temple at Uruk from roughly 3200 BC, and in sealed chambers beneath the palace at Mari from around 1800 BC. In every case, the figures were placed in foundation contexts, built into walls, sealed beneath floors, incorporated into the architecture itself. No Mesopotamian text directly explains why they required silencing. The Maklu texts describe the procedure in detail, but never record the reason. The grammatical implication of the Akkadian inscription is the detail that stops Assyriologists when they confront it. The injunction in Sumerian and Akkadian is directed at the figure itself, not at the people performing the ritual. The Sumerians were not warning each other. They were addressing something that, as far as they were concerned, could hear them. The most advanced record-keeping civilization of the ancient world built a language precise enough to write mortgage contracts and surgical procedures. When they sealed a figure in a wall and pressed the words, "It must not speak," into the clay, they were not being poetic. They were being precise. The watching figure. Long before Sumer, long before Egypt, long before the first city, or the first crop, or the first written word, someone carved a face. Not an animal. Not a symbol. A face. And the face was looking up. The Dolní Věstonice figurines of the Czech Republic, dated to approximately 26,000 BC, are among the oldest ceramic objects ever found. One figurine from the site is atypical. It has a defined face, with eyes directed upward, a convention found in almost no other prehistoric human depiction from any site on Earth. The human absence in Paleolithic art has long puzzled archaeologists. From Blombos Cave in South Africa to Lascaux in France, to the rock shelters of Bhimbetka in India, prehistoric artists depicted animals with breathtaking skill and rendered handprints with clear personal intent. But the human body, when it appeared at all, appeared as a victim, a hybrid, a figure in extremity. Paleoanthropologist Francesco De Rico of the University of Bordeaux noted in a 2003 paper in the Journal of Human Evolution that the consistent directionality of gaze in prehistoric figurines had never received a satisfactory functional explanation. Animals look forward or sideways. Humans look down or forward. The anomalous figures, the ones that fit no recognized category, look up. The upward gaze convention appears at La Pharisee in France, dated to 35,000 BC, at Hohl Fels in Germany, dated to 40,000 BC, and across the Jomon period in Japan. In every verified case, the convention is reserved for figures outside the human category. The figures that look up are always the ones that cannot be classified. Derrico observed in that same paper that at multiple sites, the upward gaze figures were found grouped together, slightly separated from human-associated deposits. They were not kept with the living. They were kept together, apart from everyone else. For 40,000 years, something in human memory kept producing the same upward-looking face and placing it apart from the human record. The face carved in the oldest ceramic object with a defined gaze was not looking at the people who made it. It was looking at what came before them. And the people who made it knew exactly where to look back. The warden figure. There is a word in the oldest written texts in human history that does not translate cleanly into any modern language. The Sumerians used it to describe a class of beings that existed before their gods, that preceded the creation of humanity, that bore what the Atrahasis epic calls the workload of the world before humans were made to carry it instead. Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobson and Jeremy Black of the Oriental Institute both noted that the term, rendered in Sumerian as the Igig Eye, is more precisely translated not as the great gods, but as those who watch and see. The watchers did not rule. They observed. And according to the oldest written account of human origins, they were already present before everything else began. The Atrahasis epic, dated to around 1700 BC, but drawing on Sumerian source material from at least 2600 BC, describes the Igig Eye as beings who labored before humanity existed. The text is explicit. They were not creators. They were not worshipped. They occupied a function, not a throne. Thorkild Jacobson and Bent Ulster of the University of Copenhagen both noted that in every depiction of the Igig Eye across the cuneiform record, they are shown not receiving worship but present at it, observing the ritual transactions between humanity and the divine. They appear in the margin of the sacred, watching the record being made. The word Igig Eye is grammatically dual in Sumerian. It does not describe a group. It describes a pair of watching forces, one directed toward the earth, one directed toward the sky. The tablet designated Vati 8917, held at the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, depicts a figure labeled in the singular form, upright, arms at sides, skull extended, in a posture identical to the anomalous figures that appear across every item on this list. That figure carries no name, no myth, only its function. The last documented reference to the Igig Eye as active beings occurs in the Neo-Babylonian period, around 600 BC. After that, they disappear from the Mesopotamian record entirely. No text records a departure. No myth describes a defeat. No ceremony marks an ending. In a literary tradition that documented everything, their absence is the loudest thing they left behind. The Sumerians did not invent the concept of the Watcher. They named it. And in naming it, they revealed that the thing being named was already ancient, a category of being that preceded their gods, preceded their civilization, and was built into the structure of their world, not as a deity to be prayed to, but as a function to be acknowledged. Every shadow figure standing unnamed in a temple carving, every blank-faced statue buried with the dead, every fractured anomaly sealed in a wall and told it must not speak, every upward-looking face carved 40,000 years before writing existed, all of them point to the same category. Something was always watching. The Sumerians just had the vocabulary to say so. The oldest civilization to leave a written record did not begin their story with creation. They began it with observation. Before the gods shaped the clay, before the flood, before the first king received his crown, something was already present and already watching. We have spent 5,000 years building cities, writing scriptures, and launching satellites into orbit. We have never found the text that records the moment they stopped, which means either they did stop and the record was lost, or they didn't. Whatever you believe about these tablets, about these figures, about the unnamed watchers encoded in the oldest writing humanity ever produced, you have now seen the pattern, the same posture, the same gaze, the same deliberate silence in the record. Across 12,000 years of human art, architecture, and scripture, something kept appearing at the edges of the frame. Something nobody named. Something everybody remembered. If this evidence has changed how you see the ancient world, leave a comment with the figure that stayed with you. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next from this archive. They were present before the first word was written. They were depicted before the first city was built. And the last civilization precise enough to name them never recorded the moment they left.